God is, in the end, after your heart, and he is after my heart. We hear Father Tony tell us this very frequently. He desires your heart and my heart, and in exchange, he shares with us his own heart. Our intentions, our actions in pursuing different things and giving of certain things reveals how much of our hearts we have given to God, or perhaps how much we have yet to give to him. And this is what we see not only in our gospel from St. Mark this morning, but also in the passage from the first book of Kings, from our first reading today, with that kind of peculiar story of Elijah and the widow. In both cases, we see powerful examples of trust, which is coming from a heart that has completely and totally given itself to God. And we see the superabundance, you might say, of God towards that person in return. From the first book of Kings, we heard that bizarre story about Elijah and this widow. And it begins with Elijah asking her for drink and for food. They're in this time of famine. Now, since we're a post-resurrection people, that is, this image ought to make us think of the moving interaction between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. We understand the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. So recall that moving moment of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well, as Jesus begins to ask her for a drink in her need, but ends by giving her the living water that is himself, and she's finally satisfied by giving herself to him. So this is the key to understanding this bizarre story for us. Because here the widow responds to Elijah's request for a drink and bread by telling him that she was going away to prepare her final meal, that she and her son would eat and then they would die, because again they're in this time of famine. And Elijah responds with, "Do not be afraid, but first feed me." Now this obviously can seem insensitive, to put it lightly, but we ought to ask, what exactly is Elijah doing here? What's he up to? Because Elijah's not being a jerk. He's not being mean to this person, to this widow. Rather, he is testing her faith. And we see Jesus do similar things throughout the Gospels himself. And we all have likely experienced something similar in our own lives, where we're going through a moment of trial or tribulation, and we may feel like God is distant, or we may feel like he's actively dejecting us, or maybe even being cruel to us. That's what our heart might feel like. But only afterwards we find that he was allowing this suffering or difficulty to come our way to test our faith. So this is kind of discernment of spirits 101 on display here. In a purely worldly sense, the widow would be justified if she was afraid that God could not provide, because in the face of famine and starvation, it would make sense, not seeing a way out, to think that it was the end. But the question was, would she trust that even if she gives this last meal of hers to God through the prophet, then God would then, through his prophet, provide and care for her family? This is the question which Elijah is, in a sense, proposing to her. Elijah, acting as the mouthpiece of God, is asking her to give a kind of tithe, to give generously, not only from her first fruits, but her entire being, to give all that she had. And in doing so, she revealed to God through Elijah that her trust was indeed entirely in God. And God can work with that sort of trust. God worked miracles of multiplication with that sort of trust, because he is not one to be outdone in generosity. Now, moving to St. Mark's Gospel, Jesus begins by telling his disciples not to act like the scribes who go about in robes and they seek salutations and places of honors, that devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers, for they will receive the greater condemnation. So here Jesus is warning not so much about the honors in themselves, but he's warning about seeking the honors in themselves. He's warning about the intentions behind them. St. Bede noted that we should notice that salutations in the marketplaces are not forbidden, nor people taking the best seats if that befits their position. Rather, the faithful are warned to avoid, as they would evil men, those who set too much store by such honors. Now, perhaps this somewhat petty example can further clarify. So when I was in the seminary, we all had our own pews, just like I'm sure you have your own pew in our church. You have your own seat in our church. Now, when we were in the seminary, of course, we didn't have our name on the pew, just like you don't have your name in your pew. But when we'd come to the chapel for morning prayer at 7 a.m., if someone was sitting in our seat, that'd be a great way to start off your day in a horrible way. For whatever reason, that would really kind of get to us. So the joke was that we were becoming priests so that we would always have our own seat at Mass and nobody would ever take it. Of course, it's a joke. But what Jesus is warning about are those who would seek these sorts of honors in themselves, those who would see that as the end goal in mind. So a scribe's heart should be about God and God alone. In fact, all of our hearts should be about God and God alone, not these sort of worldly honors like special titles, places of prominence, fancy garb. Yet many fell into seeking these sort of silly worldly honors instead of God, just as many people today, both laity and clergy alike, can easily get sucked into. Jesus warns us sternly against seeking such things in themselves, as they are a form of turning inward and sort of exalting the self. It can easily begin to be a sort of pride. So Jesus now contrasts these scribes who are seeking these worldly honors with this poor widow who places all that she has, just these 2 pennies, into the temple treasury. As Jesus is watching, he is seeing these wealthy elite members of Jewish society come and place these large sums into the treasury, these shofar chests as they were called. And finally, this poor widow comes and offers her 2 copper coins, which are worth about 1.5% of the daily wage. In essence, a very, very small amount. But nonetheless, in this seemingly small action, Jesus sees her heart. He sees through the action to the heart, and he sees that, in the grand scheme of things, this 1.5% of the daily wage didn't mean much to the temple, but her offering was far greater because she was offering her entire heart to God and giving this small, seemingly insignificant monetary offering. And Jesus takes this moment to reprove the wealthy and the scribes while exalting the widow for her upright intention and for her true generosity in giving herself entirely to God, even in her need. So when we find ourselves in need, our tendency is again to turn inward. Our tendency is to maybe ration not only our monetary means, but even our heart, to kind of keep some of it for ourselves because we feel like we're running out. But the message from our readings today is clear: to give. And when you find yourself in need, give even more, for God will not be outdone in generosity. In giving of herself entirely, the widow in the gospel received from God the gift of his own heart through Jesus, a gift of infinite worth. Although we might say that she was the poorest in the temple at that time, economically speaking, if we really think about it, she was the richest person in the temple because she had an abundance of generosity in her heart, and then she received God superabundantly in return. St. Josemaria Escriva said, "Didn't you see the light in Jesus' eyes as the poor widow left her little alms in the temple? Give what you can. The merit is not in whether it is big or small, but in the intention with which you give it." It's not about the money. It's about the heart.